Chiefs give doubters just enough ammunition every offseason to feed their delusions. With yet another fresh cast of characters at wide receiver and offensive line, suspicion of their continued dominance continues to linger. Is this the year that is finally justified? The Chargers came into 2022 with lightning hot expectations and the same excuses year after year, injuries and coaching, led to yet another underwhelming season, topped off with a poetic playoff collapse. Does new OC Kellen Moore and maybe a bit of injury luck unlock a Chiefs killer? We're searching for alpha in the AFC West. Let's hit the opening bell. It's 5:06 p.m. in New York City, Sunday, August 13th. This is Alphabets. I'm Deep Value Better with Throw the Damn Ball, Judah Fort Gang, and our guest this week, Eric Eager, PhD, Doctor of Football Analytics and stinging Twitter rebukes, and published academic author. Of course, formerly of PFF, now with Sumer Sports, seeking to bring alpha directly to NFL front offices. Eric, pumped to have you on the show. You guys are building quite the team over at Sumer.
Brett, Judah, this is always fun. Yeah, I mean, it's I've really liked you guys' content for a long time. Obviously, I had the pleasure of working with Judah last summer already. And it's so much fun to watch you guys, look at what is the sharpest market in North America, at least, and still be able to find value. So I'm incredibly pumped to be here.
Excited to have you. Okay, so let's jump right in. Look at 2023 win total futures for the AFC West. Starting at the bottom, we got the Raiders at 6.5, juiced heavily to the under. Broncos at 8.5, basically even. Chargers 9.5, slightly juiced to the over. And then with a pretty wide separation, they're at the top, the defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs at 11.5, heavily juiced to the over. So VIG adjusted more like 12. Judah, what's your alphabet for the
gonna go a little bit off the board here. I'm going to go with Broncos to finish last in the division at plus 250. I think the Chiefs and Chargers, as it goes without saying, I think will be juggernauts in the AFC West. The delta, I think, between the production of Derek Carr and what Jimmy Garoppolo presents with a much better offensive unit, I do not think makes up for kind of the gap that is being priced in. And I don't think that Russell Wilson is kind of going to turn back to 2018, 2019. I don't think Sean Payton is going to unlock the old Russ. And I think this is a defense that is prone to regression, making it that some serious value, I think, in the Broncos to finish last.
I like it. I like riding the sinking ship of Russell Wilson. So I'm with you. How about you, Eric?
Yeah, the Broncos are one on my show, the Sumer Sports Show on Friday. I've wanted to all off season put Denver in the playoffs because I think that price is 2-1. You're looking at I think a great coach, a quarterback who's been good in the past, and it's like every single day I sort of oscillate between those things. To bet that way, you'd probably go Denver over 9.5. But actually, I think I'm with my models do not like Denver as much as my heart does in this situation. So I'm actually going to go straight off the model that I have, and it's very similar to what Judah has. I'm going to go Vegas over 7.5 wins at almost 2-1. Our numbers make it, in that 7.6 range. So we make it about fair at 7.5. And it's to all the reasons Judah's talking about it. You have a quarterback who has been efficient in the past. You look at, I was actually writing the AFC West preview for next Monday for Sumer Sports, sumersports.com. And I was looking, and only 5 quarterbacks since 2017, when he was traded to San Francisco, have generated more EPA per play. And you're talking about like Mahomes, Brady, Rodgers, Breeze, and I think one other person. Or maybe that's it. Maybe I think it's 5 or 6 where he's at. So you have a quarterback who I think a lot of people don't believe is very good, but is productive. And that's, of course, a huge thing in the betting markets to exploit. Devontae Adams is pretty good. Chandler Jones, as well as Max Crosby, along with Tyree Wilson, are also players who are really good at premium positions. And as long as they stay healthy, this was a team, weirdly, in 2021, made the playoffs at 10-7, despite being fundamentally a 7-10 team. Last year, they were a 6-11 team that was fundamentally 8-9. So we all look and say that they got worse last year, when in reality they lost a lot of close games. And I see at least a little bit more luck there, especially if you want to bet some way on the Chiefs being overvalued as Super Bowl champions, the Chargers being the Chargers. And I think the last fork in it is what Judah said, which is that the Broncos, like, I think they have a high upside with a great coach, but they also have a downside with a bad quarterback. And so I think the Raiders are the way to bet into that.
I like it. Last summer, one of our highest conviction bets was fading the Raiders, who had overly optimistic expectations. As you implied, Eric, the Raiders finished 20th in player health. Waller missed 8 games. Renfro missed 7 games. And that was part of the thesis of fading the Raiders last season. It was just them having a super thin roster, and you start to get any few injuries there, and you're just overly fragile to any sort of bad injury luck. And even despite that, they did perform pretty well and remain competitive through a lot of the games, some of the things that we'll get into when we start previewing the Raiders. I would say my alphabet is going to be slightly off character, off style of what we usually pitch in this show, usually some pretty juicy plus money bets. But at KC at 12.5, all right, alt over, or the alt upside to the price. The under 12.5 is minus 155, all right, at DraftKings as of today. That just seems like very aggressive. You're talking about the Chiefs have to get 13 wins. The Chiefs have had, very positive injury luck the last 2 years, last 3 years even. And not necessarily that has to, regress by any means. But I think there is a little bit of maybe getting a little bit too comfortable with the Chiefs around continually shifting those wide receivers and kind of leaning into the Mahomes and Reed effect, and just kind of just throwing anything out there and it's just automatically going to work. I don't want to outright fade this team. Like, there were so many in the past, those Brady, Belichick teams. Like, it never paid off to fade those teams, even though year after year after year after year, they put together some kind of questionable talent on the field, yet nonetheless, they'd always kind of continue to exceed expectations. So I don't want to outright fade the Chiefs. But if I could say, are the Chiefs going to get less than 13 wins at minus 155? Yes, I'll take that. That's my alphabet for the AFC West. All right, let's look into team volatility profiles from 2022 real quick. We're looking at this from an EDP perspective, earned drive points, a metric from our drive quality model, looking at how many points do teams earn on a per drive basis, using our own kind of custom analytics. We're looking at the range of outcomes from these teams. So how consistent or inconsistent were they? Specifically, from an offensive perspective, we see 2 teams on the diametrically opposite sides there, KC and Denver, with Denver actually being very consistently bad, as we see like a very narrow hump there. And then the Chargers and the Raiders, they're both kind of having similar volatility profiles, but also skewed a little bit to the upside. And one thing that we'll get into with the Raiders is their offense was actually pretty sneaky good. Anything from you on here, Judah?
Yeah, I was going to highlight those same things, that the Broncos were consistently bad here. And we actually saw a much wider range of outcomes from Vegas and the Chargers. And just to your point, I mean, yes, Justin Herbert was hurt for a lot of last year, and obviously those wide receiver injuries play a role in it. But, if you look at just where the volatility falls and where Vegas was, it's actually a better offense by our numbers, which I think is kind of surprising, especially given the expectations for each of these teams going into 2023.
Anything from you,
this is
Eric, just around the volatility of these teams?
Yeah, I mean, this all makes sense to me. I think that it's very interesting. It's very interesting the overlap between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. I think the big question is, and it hasn't come up yet, is what is Kellen Moore going to do to, like, is he going to widen that distribution? Is he going to scoot it to the right? Those are all really good questions, because I think that beyond that, the Chargers haven't really done much this offseason. They got a first round wide receiver who was playing well into the middle part of that preseason game yesterday. That I think his impact year one will be a little bit overblown, but I think Kellen Moore can be the person to push that distribution to the right a little bit and possibly widen it out. Because again, for all these teams, I mean, this is a really good way to look at the AFC West. For all of these teams, like, their path to beating the Chiefs on a random Sunday is to widen their distribution, not to scoot it to the right, because the Chiefs are really unachievable in that regard. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, Denver has not beaten Kansas City since week 2 of 2015. Their distributions in many years simply don't overlap.
And that's one of the reasons I think Chargers could potentially dethrone the Chiefs, at least from a divisional perspective this season, potentially leaning into a little bit some of that negative injury luck for KC and positive injury luck for the Chargers. But the Chargers have always been kind of a thorn in the Chiefs' side, kind of regardless of kind of what they're standing in, especially in the Justin Herbert years. But when we look at the Raiders specifically, where they stand on an earned drive points perspective, looking at their offense and defense, Las Vegas 8th from an offensive perspective, 2.1 points per drive, but struggled on defense. One of the worst we can see here, 29th, giving up about 2.2 points per earned drive points per drive. So we can see them being a sneaky good offense. And that was even with Derek Carr not really fully coming on board and developing all the right chemistry with an elite wide receiver like Devontae Adams. They definitely struggled in the red zone. They started off games super hot. Were one of the best kind of well-scripted kind of teams out there. Definitely a good early bet. But as we saw in their volatility profile, had a very wide range of outcomes, perhaps most illustrated by the Patriots game in the middle of the season. So definitely some potential optimism around there in that, especially at least from an offensive perspective going into next year.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would just point out here, yes, the defense really struggled last year, but I'm not exactly buying so much stock in the 29th ranked team. I think it's kind of, would it shock me if they were 31st? No. Would it shock me if they were 21st? Also no. They certainly have a bunch of players who had even great rookie seasons and really struggled in year 2. I'm looking at Nate Hobbs and Trevor Moehrig, guys who graded out very well. There's certainly talent on that defense. Max Crosby is an elite edge that the placement is, if I'm looking to kind of see cases for upside here, you see just how bad their performance was. And again, the delta between the 2022 defense, which was bad, and a 2023 defense, it almost leaves room for growth as opposed to, room to the downside.
Yeah, when I look at the Raiders, I think, it's one of those situations where when our expectations are this low on a team, think about what it could be like when things go right. So you look, Nate Hobbs is a pretty good defensive back. Marcus Peters is brought over in the last moments. Like, if all of those things go right, then they do have a pass rush to be a quality defense. If they go wrong, well, we've already seen this team with a terrible defense and an okay offense, kind of get into that 6 to 9 win range. So I agree with Judah there. I think that, when you look at the Broncos on this same graph, it's similar. Like, look, that defense is amazing. They gave up, I want to say 20 points or more in 3 or fewer than 3 games in their first 15 or 14 last year, to the point where if they would have scored 20 points in any given game, they would have probably made the playoffs in the AFC, but their offense was so bad. And I don't necessarily, again, when you look at Denver, for example, the question is what kind of buttons can they push? Russell Wilson was pressured on 35% of dropbacks. He was 6th per PFF in the number of dropbacks that were pressured that were his fault. And so, like, how much can Sean Payton cut into that, right? 35 is not an egregious number. It's not like Daniel Jones, Kirk Cousins type of numbers, Justin Fields. So if that gets down to 30%, how much better are they? When he was clean, he was a league average passer. When he was in play action, he was a league average passer, not among play action players, but among all players. He had like he had passer ratings in like below league average in both clean and play action. They only ran play action 21% of the time. So there might be some meat left on the bone there. But again, you have to be, when you look at this Denver offense, Sean Payton, in my opinion, can only do so much. There were things that Nathaniel Hackett was doing that, ostensibly were going to make Russell Wilson better, and they simply didn't. And I don't know how much more can be done from the creative side to make Wilson better. So that's the one that concerns me, is if you're bearish on the Broncos, which they're bullish on the Broncos, which I kind of want to be, given I'm a huge Sean Payton fan, you have to be worried about how many levers he can actually push with this offense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for those who can't, who are just listening, Denver second from a defensive perspective, EDP, giving about 1.6 points per drive. So definitely something that held them up last year. Probably would have been even worse if the defense wasn't elite. But as we move into looking at the Raiders 2022 power ranking volatility was definitely the name of their kind of the theme that defined their 2022 season. And I think it's also really important to talk about, how the expectations for this team have dramatically changed from season to season. So as I mentioned earlier, pounding Raiders alt under was one of our favorite bets last year. But even at the regular price, they were priced at 8.5, heavily juiced to the over. So we were betting the under at like plus 120 at that 8.5, and then leaning out into the alts. And now they're priced 2 games lower. And so just immediately change in the repricings of the expectations for the Raiders. They ended up going 6-11, but 8-9 ATS. Their average rank was surprisingly around 18th. So the market certainly had more elevated expectations for this team relative to their overall record. Their 7-day rolling volatility was plus or minus about 3.5 spots. And we can see they're a little bit all over the map over the course of the season. Even our drive quality model not really getting a good handle on how to bet this team or how to approach this team, mostly primarily due to a lot of that in-game and unpredictable volatility that we saw from the Raiders.
Yeah. And I think we can get to this even in the next slide here. But what almost defined this season was a bunch of fourth quarter collapses. And I'm thinking of that Jaguars game, which we bet the Jaguars there, calling the bottom. But even looking at that, there's the Monday Night Football game against the Rams, where they lost on that Baker Mayfield last second touchdown again, just like very conservative, not running on 4th and 1. A loss to the Colts also, again, they lost in the fourth quarter. All of these kind of culminated in, and there was a 13-10 loss in the Steelers, I remember, on I think it was like Christmas night or Saturday night game or something like that, which almost defined the season. And like those, you talk about one-score games and how maybe there like is less signal. Or I should say, when we talk about one-score games, we often say like, oh, we can throw it off. Maybe there's actually more signal in one-score wins as opposed to one-score losses, things of that sort. But really, if you pay attention to these games, these were true one-score games that really, like a 4th and 1 that could have gone another way, could really change the Raiders' season. And I think the power rankings would be very different had those results flip-flopped.
Yeah, the week 2 game against Arizona, you had Murray in a 16-point comeback on one of the 2-point conversions, ran for like a 30-second play and ended up in the end zone. You had, I can't remember what they had another 2-pointer that probably was a drop by AJ. Like that game had a million ways for the Raiders to win, and they ended up losing. And then the Kansas City game on Monday night, they had a 17-point lead in that game in Kansas City, lost that game by a single point. It was and you had these games in the middle, like when they didn't even cross the 50 against New Orleans, that kind of like steadied us all at this idea that they weren't very good. But for the most part, like they had games that they should have won. And in fact, I think if you would have cut the season off at like week 15 or 16, I think the Raiders' Pythag would have probably been that of at least a 500 team or so. They kind of faded down the stretch against some bad teams, faded down the stretch against some great teams like Kansas City. But for the most part, were just playing close games all year.
Yeah, I'll just echo
as you
this.
mentioned. Yeah, go on, Drew.
I was going to say, looking at the max leads of some of the games they lost, it's staggering. 17-point lead against the Chiefs, a 20-point lead against the Cardinals, a 13-point lead against the Rams, and a 10-point lead against the Niners. These are some double-digit leads that they're consistently blowing. Pretty remarkable, and certainly I think would kind of define the season.
Yep. And even beyond just having those leads, because you could get a lead like first 2 drives, boom, boom, and then for the rest of the game you suck. And so the max lead could potentially be a little bit misleading. But that's one of the reasons why we bring in the time-weighted average margin, TWAM. Again, we're looking at what's the lead or deficit they had multiplied by the time they held that lead. The TWAM in that Cardinals game was double digits. Their time-weighted average margin was 11 points, and they still lost. Their time-weighted average margin versus the Rams was over a touchdown at 8.7, and they ended up losing. Their time-weighted average margin versus the Steelers was almost a touchdown, and they ended up losing. So not only just some games that they had the lead, but they had the lead for the majority of the games and having some like really late collapses there. And then also it's really funny too, you called out that Saints game that started to potentially shift some betting market expectations around what this team actually is, a 24-0 loss in New Orleans. It was only a 1-point spread. The Raiders were the 3rd ranked circa pick. So people loved the Raiders that week, get their faces ripped off, but still believed the next week. So the next week they played the Jags, and they were the 2nd ranked circa pick. And they come back and lose that one and also don't cover.
Those are 2 independent groups of people picking them too, because the people that picked them the previous week were out of the tournament. So like that, they were loved by 2 separate, distinct groups of people.
Yep. Yeah. So there was always this belief system there, but also to your point, Eric, kind of trying to read between the lines, read between some of the final scores and some of the superficial overall records. You mentioned Pythag. One of the metrics that we use is a custom kind of tweaking of Pythag. We call Pythag 2.0. Instead of looking at points for, points against, we look at points in excess of betting market expectations for the offense and the defense. And Pythag 2 brings out the Raiders to about 8.5 wins. In fact, so exactly to your point, that this team was actually pretty relatively average. And we've done some research. And again, we've shown that Pythag 2.0 is more predictive than Pythag when trying to evaluate a team from a more macro perspective the following season. So that could also provide some signal there around potential future performance from the Raiders. When we look at their offseason changes, as we mentioned, obviously added Jimmy G, added Jacoby Myers, nothing really else beyond that. Of course, lost Derek Carr, but also Darren Waller. So something that I don't feel like registers on like a major headline perspective too much. I haven't seen it too much, but he's now on the Giants. Also Rock Yasin, and also I was very surprised that they let Jarrett Stidham go. He played the last few games. He played the last 2 games, and even though they lost both of those, played really tough, looked really impressive, I thought, versus the Niners. And then the grand finale versus the Chiefs, didn't look too good, but it seemed like everyone was kind of giving up then as well. I liked what I thought from Jarrett Stidham. I thought they were going to potentially lean into him to potentially be kind of roll the dice at least for a season or 2 rather than going the Jimmy G direction. Did you guys like Stidham?
Yeah, I don't. His projection out of Auburn wasn't the greatest, but and you saw him play a little bit in the pandemic year. Not terribly impressive, but the Niners game was very good. That was a great defense, and that I thought he could be something. Now, the funny thing is my first impression was, they're just going with the Josh McDaniel guy and Brian Hoyer, but in theory, like Jarrett Stidham is just every bit as much of a Josh McDaniel guy as Hoyer is. So it was an interesting one. I think that they're just going with the veteran backup. And frankly, like some backups like Stidham kind of got really good contracts this offseason. Like he got, tens of millions of dollars to go over and play for Denver. Similarly, saw the same thing with Taylor Heineke going to Atlanta. Like there were some like good backups that have sort of retreated into that like highly paid backup Chase Daniel type contracts. And And so maybe the Raiders simply weren't offering him that.
Yeah. The thing I find pretty interesting about the Jimmy G and Jared Stidham is that a lot of the teams that are priced in last in their division this year, they've got serious fat left tails where it's like if the Bucs are bad, they're 0-6, the whole staff's getting fired. The incentives kind of align that way. Same thing, I guess, not with the Rams necessarily, the staff getting fired, but just like totally giving up on the season. This to me signals, and they have every incentive to. Josh McDaniels is in his second year here, that they're playing to win, and they're kind of like no matter what's happening, they're going to be playing. There's no giving up on the season in the same way that we have for a bunch of these other last place teams. And I think the point with Garoppolo is that McDaniels, say what you will about his success as a head coach, I think has been a great offensive coordinator. In a funny way, it's actually very similar to John Gruden. Like his offenses have performed probably better than the talent on the field. And I think Garoppolo is almost the perfect quarterback for that. Like he became the example of that, obviously, with Kyle Shanahan. But this is a guy who I think, given good surroundings, can produce at a fine level. Does that mean like in isolation, for making Madden grades, that Jimmy Garoppolo would be a 95? No. But his production, which is what matters at the end of the day, is that of kind of his surroundings. And I think when you look at Jacoby Myers, who's a guy who I think is one of the more underrated receivers in the NFL. If you look at him after the catch, his ability to earn targets, his separation, all of them really pop. I don't think we think of him as like a top 20, top 25 receiver, but by all means, his metrics would suggest that. Yes, Darren Waller's gone. He didn't really play last year, which is why I think we're not really hearing much of it. Hunter Renfrow, obviously one of the best route runners in the league and dynamic in the red zone. And like Devontae Adams is still an alpha number one receiver. Like add in the fact that Josh McDaniels is a good offensive coordinator. Like the receiving unit is much deeper this year. They have plenty of talent. Like I just see this as a fine offense. I don't think that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to elevate them to new heights, but it also has a really, really high floor.
It's funny, yeah, because I mean, there's a lot more kind of at least some brewing bullish optimism around the arrival of Josh McDaniels. That seems like it's totally sold off and is now flipped to almost a borderline negative, at least the way the betting market kind of is pricing that. And I mean, Josh McDaniels does seem like potentially one of those head coaches that kind of comes in, does well as in the coordinator position, but isn't necessarily built to be a head coach to run kind of an organization, and has kind of struggled in those positions. And, so one of the things that's always good to keep in mind as you continue to see those transitions, some things that we've talked about in the past, for future OCs kind of rotating into head coaching positions. But when we look at the Raiders 2023 schedule, again, priced at 6.5, big adjusted actually closer to 6 due to the juice. The Pythag 2.0 model, again, based on that, seeing those over that priced over the expectations versus reality. Pythag 2.0 likes betting the over. Strength of schedule, ostensibly ranked the second. We've talked about that in the past, but not a really good indicator of what realized strength of schedule will ultimately be by the end of the season. So, but that is something notable that is certainly being priced into some of the bearish expectations for the Raiders, priced into that 6.5, that, hey, the Raiders are going to play a super tough schedule. And no doubt about it, they play in a very tough division. But again, that can all kind of change over the course of the season. Even when they do play for a team like the Chiefs, for instance, maybe that's one of the games where Mahomes is gimpy and he misses, the 2 or 3 games that he might miss in a season, or with the Bills or with the Chargers. And the second to, the toughest schedule in the league ends up being just kind of league average. And that's how you can sneak over, that something like that 6.5.
Yeah. I mean, it works in both directions, right? You can have like the Niners beat the Bears beat the Niners last year. And also, like, you can look at teams. Remember, we might be looking back and being like, remember when we thought the Broncos had a chance of being good? Remember when we thought the Vikings were going to be like a fine to mediocre team, and they turn out to like go, 5-12? It works in both directions. But I think the point that's kind of crystallizing here is that you can look at things like strength of schedule. I think when you're looking at the margins of like a 9.5 win team, a 10 win team, where the prices are kind of tighter, when the expectations are so low and you're kind of adding in strength of schedule to that, I really don't think that has too much. I mean, there might be signal in sourcing the pricing, but I don't think it kind of works in actually getting a fair price there.
Yeah, a lot of primetime games for the Raiders next year. Monday Night Football versus the Packers Monday Night Football versus the Lions Thursday Night Football versus the Chargers, another Monday Night Football game versus the Chiefs. One piece of research I do want to flag that I do want to do some research on that I haven't read about in the past is just, are outcomes amplified kind of following primetime games? Again, for a team that's priced at 6.5 wins, not supposed to be that good, for primetime games is pretty good. Let's move into the Broncos. One chart I want to flag that I put together was just to demonstrate how bad Russell Wilson played last year. I wanted to overlay his performance from an EPA perspective versus how Tim Tebow played over the 2010-2011 season. And Tim Tebow quite decisively outperformed Russell Wilson. As we know, Tim Tebow pretty much never got a meaningful shot at playing quarterback again after that season. And yet there is still, again, a lot of still optimism around how Russell Wilson could potentially resurrect his career. One of the things that I was just trying to think about anecdotally, have we ever seen, a top 5 quarterback, which I would say Russell Wilson could certainly have been positioned in over the first decade of his career, certainly earned a contract that would suggest that is the case, fall so flat on his face, not just 1 year. Because one of the things we were talking about in the last offseason's previews was I was talking about how I think there has been more than enough signs that Russell Wilson's prime is in his past, and that there's been a ton of kind of apologists based on, this injury and this and that, and now, the offensive line. And now there's kind of similar apologists kind of this offseason for why he performed so bad last offseason. Have we ever seen a quarterback who's a top 5 play so bad for over a season, 2 years, in my opinion, 3 years, and make a considerable bounce even to do anything to even flirt with that top 5 status again? Anything come to mind for you guys?
Not really. I think that there's, if you look, and this is way back, but like Jim Everett led the NFL in touchdown passes in 88 and 89, took the Rams to the NFC title game back when they were the LA Rams against the Niners, made a Pro Bowl in 1990. And then in 1991 and 92, he played so poorly to lose his job. And then when he went to New Orleans, he actually was pretty good again. But even then, no, I mean, this is on, usually when a quarterback loses his fastball, I mean, Andrew Luck had one 2015. He was really bad in the PFF system. 2016 and 2018, he was really good. And that was injury based. But again, Andrew Luck is probably not who you want to look to if you're Russell Wilson, right? Because he had to retire, because of physical issues prior to the 2019 season. So there aren't that many good ones. I'll say that much. As far as poor play, and then coming back, Peyton Manning had early in his season a year where he led the league in interceptions, that kind of thing. But for the most part, no.
Yeah, to be fair, I don't think anyone's kind of had a coach as successful as Sean Payton come in, so that's maybe a co-founder that's not accounted for. But I think that's maybe only the kind of positive thing I'll say on this. What worries me about kind of Russell Wilson rejuvenating his career, and this gets into I think what I was talking about earlier, is that they're not at all stylistically similar to the quarterbacks that played in New Orleans, specifically Drew Brees. I'm looking at the quick game, which is an area on which Drew Brees really, really excelled. He was number 1 in the NFL. I've got data from 2016 to 2020 with a .36 EPA. Russell Wilson running quick game has been a negative EPA player throughout his career. Also with the Saints offense, which is based on kind of obviously quick throws, but also throws to the middle of the field where the receivers can kind of generate yards after the catch. It relies upon accurate quarterbacks, and Russell Wilson has not been an accurate quarterback over the middle of the field. Again, looking at Drew Brees' number, he was a top 5 passer in accuracy, especially over the middle of the field every single year. Russell Wilson has been towards the low 20s. And the Broncos receiving weapons, while good, are not exactly kind of system fits, at least in the way that Sean Payton was scheming his offense in New Orleans. None of these guys are particularly good after the catch. Maybe Jerry Jeudy's fine by my numbers. He's maybe a little bit above average. Cortland Sutton is way below average. Who knows what his health is like? They've already lost to Patrick. The depth is kind of going there. I just don't see it as a system fit. And while I love Sean Payton, I don't see how you can kind of. It seems more like you're putting a square in a round hole.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that the one way that this Broncos team can make a run for it this year to me is if they just pivot to running the football. And I know that like that's like sacrilegious, relative to where we are, but like they get Mike McGlinchey to go play right tackle. They, as Judah said, their wide receivers aren't exactly quick game wide receivers. They're kind of a blast from the past when you think about how teams used to do, how teams basically used to go run, pass, right? In the sequencing. Their wide receivers are very much it's 3rd and 7 because we ran twice and only gained 3 yards. Funny. And then you throw a back shoulder fade to one of them, and that's how you get a first down, and then you go back to being ground and pound. They're not a team that I think about like those old Steelers teams that had all those quick yak receivers. Big Ben would just take the snap and throw it quick to them. Like that's not who they are, and they're not that way at tight end either. They're not that way. Even the running backs, like Javonte Williams, is not a great receiver relative to how good he is as a runner. So, like, when the problem with that thinking is Denver's schedule, for my numbers, is a half a point harder per game than the average team on a neutral. So, like, they're not, if they want to be a run first team, the issue is that the game scripts that they're going to be underneath are not conducive to that on average. If we assume that if we assume preseason projections are what they are and the scheduled strength is what it is, it's just like they're behind the 8 ball in that respect.
Mm-hmm. And even with that, again, elite defense last year still ended up going 5-12, 7-10 ATS. I mean, I thought this was a bug in my code. I guess I forgot. I mean, I knew Broncos expectations were sky high last year, but 10.5. And I just looked it up elsewhere. That is correct. They were priced at 10.5 wins last year. So, fell well under those expectations. We look at their power rank volatility, just like sinking ship. Started off as a top 10 team and flirted with being one of the worst teams in the league. At number 31st, they bottomed right there at 12, and then got a little bit of an elevation with a few covers there versus Ravens, Chiefs, Cards, another one versus the Chiefs, but ending the season as a bottom 3 team. Rolling volatility, and you would expect this when a team gets so violently repriced over the course of the season. Rolling volatility plus minus 6.5 spots. So jumping almost 25% of the league, like on a week to week basis, is how shifty this team was, and how the markets had to continually adjust to actually how bad this team was. I mean, especially that first 3 weeks. I mean, losing on the road for Seattle when they're a heavy favorite, a touchdown favorite. I think half of the survivor leagues were gone. After that one game, come back, put another stinker together, beat the Texans, but as a 11-point favorite, squeak it out by a touchdown. We're losing that game for a while, and then have a hideous, I never seen an 11-10 score, but 11-10 score at home versus the Niners in prime time, barely squeaked that one, and another super ugly game. And it was just all downhill from there. I mean, this team never flirted with really putting together a decent offensive performance, only held up by their defense, as we talked about from an earned drive perspective, was second, giving up only 1.6 points per game or per drive. Are they going to be able to keep that together? This offense doesn't look too much different than it was last year. They've already lost Tim Patrick. Yes, they have Sean Payton, but I don't know, is that going to, and I know we've seen some other head coaching ranks where Sean Payton is like worth a whole game or something along those lines. And maybe that does come to fruition, but there's just so little to work with here. And I think Russell Wilson's such a ghost of his former past that there's really very little to potentially put back together there. And Eric, as you talked about, maybe this is a team that has to lean into the run. That doesn't sound super explosive, a team that's going to be scoring, 28 or 30 points a game, which means your defense is going to have to be super elevated again to outperform even this year's expectations.
Yeah. I mean, I just, it's an upward climb for them. Defensively, they lose Ejiro Evero, which I think is a much bigger blow than a lot of people like that. If we were previewing the NFC South, that would be one of my buy cases on the Panthers. He was fantastic a season ago. It sucks because I think when a lot of people handicap these teams, they say, well, Sean Payton comes in and he adds a win. And it's like, I don't necessarily disagree with that. But I also think you're not allowed, like, you're ineligible to win 10 games last year. And so all the stuff that comes over from last year that you wish to stay the same, like your defensive ability and all that, like that, you re-rack that every year. And so injuries, what if Patrick Surtain were to go down, or what if he were to regress a little bit, like AJ Terrell did last year, and stuff like that. It's like that doesn't necessarily make him a bad player, of course, but it does make it harder to win when you've basically you had the nuts defensively last year and you still couldn't win. That doesn't mean you get to carry over those cards to the next year.
Yeah. I would highlight that the loss of Elijah Vero is so huge, and it's something we're bringing up now on basically every podcast. I think defensive coordinators are really, truly important. This is research that we did last summer, talking about how secondary play is almost as much about the position a cornerback is placed in or a safety is placed in as much as it is the talent that that player possesses. And I think if we're looking just from a macro view and where the market might be, where there might still be like serious edges, and I think it's really evaluating kind of coordinators and the value they can bring on the field. And I think the Broncos are a prime example of a team that on defense is going to get worse just by virtue of losing the defensive coordinator. And we know what Vance Joseph is. I think he's fine, but he's certainly not going to be getting head coaching calls, I don't think, like the previous coordinator was.
And when we look at the active points perspective, Broncos negative 62 active points last season. Again, active points, looking at how do they outperform betting and market expectations. Betting and market expectations are adjusting week to week. So, and they, as we saw, were getting downgraded week after week after week after week. So even as expectations were coming down, the team still struggled to meet even downgraded expectations last year. So when we look at 2023, again, being priced at 8.5, so repriced 2 games lower than they were last year. Strength of schedule ostensibly 10th, net rest minus 5 days. Python 2.0 model does like the Broncos over, and that mostly goes to a lot of, again, they did have leads in 13 games, and it was just that they couldn't hold those leads because they got a lead of 10 or double digits in 6 games. But again, it was only pretty much 10 points, and then they could barely score anything over 20 points, as kind of well documented. And so it's going to be very difficult to kind of replicate that, again, that defensive performance next season. Anything from you guys on just the schedule as we look at it for the season?
What I do like for the Broncos, and again, this is, you can test this empirically. The team hasn't been as good since they won the Super Bowl, but like when you play early season games in Denver, it is just hotter, and the altitude does give a higher, like a home field advantage that is different than most. And you saw that like the 2021 year, they started hot. 2020 similarly, even when they didn't have great teams. And this was one of the reasons. The other reason, and this is why it's so hard to do this, 2021, they started off with like an easy schedule of like the Jets and the Jaguars and stuff as well. But, what I do like, if you are looking at the bull case for the Broncos, you're looking at, 3 games that are very winnable at home in the first 4 weeks of the season. And that's beneficial. You also do, you get 3 games that are winnable early at home, which I do like.
Yeah. It's also something we've been working on as a dynamic kind of home field advantage model, which is to say that the home field advantage of one team, early in the season might be very different than later in the season, stuff of that sort. And I think that the data certainly has pointed us to exactly what you're outlining. And the Broncos, Denver teams across all sports have a massive home field advantage. And I think the kind of home away splits matter maybe a little more for the Broncos than they do other teams. And to your point, especially early, there are a lot of very winnable games that you'd want to be playing at home to kind of lock in.
The other one to be cognizant. And again, I've been oscillating back and forth between liking the Broncos and not every single day this offseason. The other one is when you think about a team like the Jets, who they have, it was one of the teams that they have in their first 5 at home. That's a team that, much like the 2020 Tampa Bay Bucks, like that might be a team that is better later in the season than in the beginning, acclimating to a new QB and some young players even. And Kansas City getting them both in the first half of the season. The Chiefs have been, they're basically playing the Chiefs during what has historically been kind of their downtime. The Chiefs will start out the season very hot. Mahomes week 1 is like the best quarterback to ever play. And then they finish the season hot. The Chiefs didn't lose last year after the first week in December. And the Broncos got them kind of in that last stretch last year. They get them in like October, November-ish this year, which is probably going to be beneficial to them relative to others. So the schedule actually, even though it's not like game for game that easy, I think the way it's structured actually benefits the Broncos.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. You get these kind of quarterbacks in transition into new systems right off the bat. And then also with the Jets, so 3 out of the first 5 games. You get the Bills coming out of the bye, at least. So not some terrible. And as your point with a good observation about the Chiefs is usually this is kind of their bottoming process where they're kind of underperforming expectations the most and then kind of propel into the end of the season. So that's probably not a bad place to potentially get. Again, you're getting the Chiefs twice in that, so potentially at their weakest.
Yep, and you don't finish off like notice there are no big negative spreads for them in the second half of the season, really after the Buffalo game. So again, this is a team where we'll probably know by those first few Chiefs games whether they're good or not. But much like Detroit last year, even if they start out slow, the thing closes out well. So if they're fundamentally a good football team, like they'll be able to pick up some wins against some poor teams down the stretch, much like a team like Detroit did, who is in a similar situation as Denver was, kind of trying to look ahead at being slightly better than 500 to beat all the bets.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this was that I just like that this team is a perfect team to bet live, I think, for exactly the reasons Eric mentioned. I also kind of want to look at the scheme and see what they're trying to do, especially given that the schedule might lead to some noise, as we've outlined. Like, is this a team that's kind of going run heavy, or are they going, play action, tossing it deep, kind of playing to Russell Wilson's strengths? So they're trying to run a New Orleans offense. There are a lot of question marks. I think the schedule is particularly conducive to making, in-season futures bet around week 4, week 5, week 6.
Let's move on to the Chargers. Looking at their offensive and defensive EDP, kind of looking there a little bit right there in the middle. Had one of the better offenses, but again, struggled on defense. But there's just so many asterisks for the Chargers, given, again, the same story kind of year in and year out, is that they've been banged up with cluster injuries, specifically last year, offensive line, wide receiver, kind of across the defense, and then marred by a lot of question marks around coaching staff and in-game decisions and how they're leveraging the talent on the field, and specifically Herbert, which to many people's evaluators is a top 5, if not top 3 quarterback, being severely underused. Now, again, lacking some of the potential personnel to really exploit that talent, but nonetheless, still a lot of criticisms around not being able to kind of throw deep downfield. 6.4 air yards per attempt last year, lowest of all quarterbacks who played any sort of meaningful time, threw only 11 passes over 30 yards downfield, threw at or behind the line of scrimmage at the 4th highest rate, dumped off to running backs, especially when the wide receivers were banged up, anywhere from 30 to 40% of the time. Eckler led the team in targets at 127. Of course, we know Herbert had that rib injury, had the shoulder injury, but he still kind of powered through it. And this was a team that ended up being 1-5 versus teams with winning records. And as we know, really had that epic collapse in the playoffs versus the Jags. But it all kind of comes together. If you're reading a story about the Chargers, this lines up right down the middle.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a team that has forever done this, right? They put together a lot of really solid, talented players. I mean, they went right from one kind of borderline Hall of Famer in Phillip Rivers to what I think everybody believes is a great quarterback. Still struggle there. I think, much like the Chargers, they just struggle in the margins, right? They have a coach who in 2021 had a top 5, and this is like NFL Fast Start era. But if you look at the coaches that added the most expected win probability from 4th down decisions, Brandon Staley's 2021 season was top 5 in the NFL Fast Start era. Last year, he was still a top coach in terms of all decisions, but the 4th down ones he specifically reneged on, and that was, you can imagine, in large part because of some high-profile losses the year before, one in Los Angeles to the Chiefs on Thursday night, and one to the Raiders on that final Sunday night where they lost a playoff berth. So that went away last year. Then there was, obviously Herbert was injured, and that was a legitimate injury. Like when, and people fading. I know I probably messaged this to Judah when that happened, is like people in Kansas City locker rooms like, this is a real injury. He's going to try to play through it, but this is real. And you look, they struggled against Jacksonville. They struggled against Houston. They basically, were not the same when he was injured. Then he got back to being a little bit healthier down the stretch and it was fine. But they struggle, for example, in the Brandon Staley era with the too high stuff. They're second worst in EPA allowed per run play in the NFL the last 2 years. They're tied for worst in terms of success rate allowed. So defensively, they want to play kind of the woke too high shell stuff, but they don't have the big guys up front to actually make it work. And some teams have been exploiting them as well. So it's one of those teams where they're always a day late and a dollar short, I think. And hopefully Kellen Moore can help them, alleviate that. But they're always like the same old charges is both bad luck, but also leaving yourself a lack of outs when you do have the bad luck.
Yeah. I think it almost leaves the Chargers in such an interesting spot because like people know, and I think the Chargers brass certainly knows like exactly what you're pointing out, that they're one step late. And maybe this is a complete galaxy brain take, but it's almost like the Chargers have kind of been listening to the media a season behind, where it's like, oh, they're going for too many fourth downs. Let's be conservative. That's 2021 going into 2022. 2022, it's like Joe Lombardi's too conservative. We need to kind of let Herbert unleash. They go to Kellen Moore. And I kind of see this as the year where everything, it's an all or nothing year, right? I'm pretty sure this is Herbert's last year, kind of before his extension kicks in. Maybe there's one more after that. But this is the all or nothing season. They're bringing in Kellen Moore. They're going to unleash it on the field. We know that. Brandon Staley knows he's fighting for his job. I imagine he's going to be more aggressive. It didn't really help last year, kind of the way his fourth down decision making went. I expected to return to year one. And look, at the end of the day, I think the case for the Chargers is that there's obviously talent on the defense. They, as Eric's saying, I really just need to kind of plug the middle. Sebastian Joseph Day was really terrible in run defense last year. It was a big disappointment. But at the end of the day, Justin Herbert is an elite quarterback. I think Quentin Johnson should maybe help a little bit, at least certainly to the receivers they had last year. And if you've got a top three quarterback in the league, anything's possible. And I think that if everything kind of crystallizes with the Chargers, and Kellen Moore has elevated Dak Prescott in the past, I think he's one of the coordinators who can certainly do that too for Justin Herbert, even though he probably doesn't need any elevation. And at the end of the day, that's the bullish case for the Chargers. Is you have Herbert, and you have, I think, a good coach and a team that really knows this is the year. It's all or nothing.
Yeah, and Eric, I think you make some good call-outs around the 2021 Staley and some of the bets that he made during that season that maybe didn't pay off, high-profile games, and that kind of added some undue pressure that potentially then therefore changed his kind of paradigm of decision-making in 2022 because the risk-reward trade-off has now changed. And I think that's his own fault. I think one that doesn't jump out as much as the ones that you mentioned, Eric, the one that comes to mind for me is early in 2021 versus the Ravens when they went for a fourth down early in the game on their own 23-yard line, very tongue-in-cheek, and it didn't work out, and things kind of spiraled out of control from there, and they ended up getting their faces ripped off by the Ravens in that game. And it's those types of decisions that they're just way too high leverage, not just for the game, but for your career. And it's those types of decisions that therefore has potentially shaken his confidence. And we know so many things in sports are definitely confidence games. And if he doesn't have the confidence to make those sort of decisions or otherwise put himself in a position to get, again, undue influence from others throughout the organization, say, got a little bit of a wrist slap and say, don't do that anymore. He made those bets at very poorly timed points in time in the season when it wasn't worth it to really do that, not just for the game, again, but for the career. And now I think he's kind of, paying the penalty for that in this type of year.
Well, I think that's the problem with not having a model, right? I think you guys are very quantitative. I've gotten to work with Judah before. I know how sharp he is. And obviously, Brett, you're There's no doubt that you are as well. But like, it's the thing about, there are people who are sharp that have good intuition. And this is like the example. Like, I don't think Brandon Staley's like listening to the win probability, right? The same way that you guys are looking at your models and being like, hey, there's a 14% edge on the Raiders over. Like, they're not doing that. Him and like Dan Campbell and guys like that, they're like, rule of thumb is to be aggressive, right? And that can, to your point, Brett, about like that Ravens game, it was like 2 or 3 fourth downs that really got them in a bad place, and they lose by a margin. And there's a little bit of research that I'm doing with a former colleague of mine, where we're looking just at that. It's like, are there fourth down decisions that are career optimizing but not win probability optimizing?
I like that.
And that's like that's a key thing. Like, when you look at, I was sitting with an NFL team 2 or 3 years ago, and we were talking about fourth down decisions. Like, we were watching a game together. He's like, well, what would you do here? I'm like, well, you have to go for it. And he's like, well, we didn't go for it because we didn't want to lose by 17. We wanted to lose by 10. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's what you're saying. And I think like, it's the difference between like all these coaches, there still isn't that analytics coach yet. Maybe Sirianni, but even Sirianni punted on that fourth down that Kadarius Toney ran back for almost a touchdown. Like, for all these guys, when you're just still going by rules of thumb, what can turn you sharp can also turn you dull in the same way, right? Whereas if he was actually going through and be like, oh, there's a 2% edge on going for it here, we're just gonna go for it, then I think like guys like us are like, oh, he's cheating on the math. But he's not actually cheating on the math. He didn't know the math in the first place. He knew that for the most part, being aggressive was the right thing to do. And then somebody else told him the right thing to do was to keep his job and to go for fewer of them. And that's what he's doing. So that's where I get worried about kind of anointing any coaching staff or anything. And you guys have talked about this on your show for years now. It gets to a really tricky part about betting what should happen versus betting what a team really will do. And I'm interested to see what that ends up being for the Chargers this year. What should they do? They should go for a lot of fourth downs. What will they do? I'm not exactly sure yet.
Yeah. It's funny because it took a whole season actually for that to start to come to pass. Because I think in 2021, the perception was that Staley was like the next analytics whiz kid coming to the league to revolutionize and come together with truly analytical decision making, not just kind of gut, like, oh, I think we should be aggressive, and so therefore I guess we should just be aggressive. But that has like kind of come to pass and has kind of been fleshed out kind of over time. But I know that definitely wasn't the kind of underlying belief early, in 2021. Yeah.
No, I think the belief was that he was a very smart defensive coach. But I mean, they went to Kansas City in week 3, and now there was a lot of wind and stuff, but like he was going for, like, I think the game-winning touchdown was on a fourth down fade to Mike Williams, where a field goal would have won the game, but there was wind and stuff like that. And then he went for a few fourth downs, even in like a week 3 game. And people were like, oh, is this going to be different? And for the most part, there was a fourth down that he went for that the math didn't like. And I'm kind of like, oh, so he just is aggressive. And that's cool because being aggressive is great. But even if you look at like Dan Campbell does a pretty good job. But if you look at how he handles the clock, he very clearly doesn't have a complete and full analytical understanding of the game. He's very good at some things, and he pushes those buttons. But there are other parts of the game where he's still coaching like a caveman, for lack of a better phrase.
I just have to interrupt the whole story here. I so vividly remember Brett and I watching that fourth game. That game, we're talking about the fourth down, and Brett goes, I think Brandon Staley's just aggressive. And then immediately you tweet, I think Brandon Staley's just aggressive. And it all came full circle.
Oh, yeah, I think that's when we were making a joke, is like, Eric's got some listening devices over here or something.
Exactly. But the thing that I keep coming back to with the Chargers here is almost outlining what I'll be looking for. Almost when I prepare for live betting, let's say, I have a bunch of things in my head. We were talking about this with Andy last week about, I want to have certain examples. I want to see something that happens and I'll be like, I'm going to quit because, this team is, I thought one thing was going to happen and another thing's happening. Like, I'm not going to keep live betting. And so do you have cases for the upside.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I'm viewing the Chargers this offseason, which is like, I want to have a proper frame. I'm not betting it because there's too much conjecture. Like, no one can really know how Brandon Staley is going to approach these things. And obviously, it's so high leverage and so important in determining who's going to actually win the game. But like, we from the outside can't possibly know how he's going to react. But I want to kind of have an outline of like, how am I going to attack the Chargers given what actually does happen? How does their offense look with Kellen Moore? Like, we could project that it's going to be, you know, a bunch of deeper throws, but like maybe Justin Herbert actually just checks down a lot, and that's fundamental to his style. Like, those are kind of questions that are not really answered yet, and I don't want to kind of coach my bet in that way without actually seeing it happen on the field.
Yeah, that's a really well put thing, because I think a lot of the football people that I respect, a lot of them are wrong about a lot of stuff, right? I mean, that's why they're not professional bettors. But the one thing about Herbert they all say is like, oh, he's so quick of he's such a quick processor. And it's like, well, I think that's part of why he checks the ball down, though, right? He's the good kid in class. He gets all the A's and stuff, but he's not technically creative. And like, I don't necessarily know if I believe that, but I am open to the idea that he is part of the problem. And, you know, most of the ball knowers on Twitter will tell you like, no, it's literally never his fault. But I have a hard time believing. I mean, when you're a quarterback in the NFL, you're management. Like, you're part of the your failures are partially your fault. And I worry with Herbert because we're on year 4 now, and he really hasn't had any success to speak of. And we do make a lot of excuses because he's uber talented, but I'm open to the idea that maybe he's part of the problem.
That's definitely true. And also, Eric, man, I'm very excited to see what comes about of this research that you're doing, this in-game decision-making, how it crosses with career optimization. Because I don't know if you were thinking about it from a live betting perspective, but, you know, kind of anything that Judah and I kind of digest is filtered through that kind of prism. And this is exactly what you need to tweak any sort of kind of decision-making model around how you're trying to predict what's going to actually happen in the game. Because there's so much right now, there's so much criticism and kind of Monday morning quarterbacking around how decisions are made on the field from a very academic perspective, as if it's happening in isolation, in a silo. And that's not the real world. That's not a practical application. And this is the difference between, you know, in traditional finance, like the difference between an economist and an investor and a trader. And economists, like there's a famous saying that there's no billion-dollar economist. Economists do not, their decision-making frameworks oftentimes, and a super majority of times, are not applicable to real-world decision-making and the way the real world works. It's totally theoretical, all things else equal. And if this and if that and all these baked-in assumptions that is not, you know, demonstrative or reflective of how to actually make money ahead of, you know, the way things actually operate in the world. So I think exactly the type of research you're talking about is the types of things that I think could be super plus EV, unlock a lot of true alpha that we talk about on this show. Excited to see what comes about of that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I just have thought about it numerous times, and that's always the answer that people have given me. And so, you know, I've made a lot of, I mean, Judah, there was the same thing when you were doing research with me at PFF. Like I've had a lot of ideas just by talking to people and thinking about how they think. And, you know, there's, you know, the famous thing is not necessarily telling somebody that what they're saying isn't true, but it's saying what is what you're saying true about, and then finding what that about is. And, you know, that's important. And I agree with you. I think the one big thing about win probability models, Ben has just done a fantastic job with his, but there's no error bars either. And so how many times are these decisions 1% decisions where the error bars overlap? You know, and what can you glean from that? Because I think that a lot of coaches would tell you that the error bars intersect a lot, and they're just making the conservative choice. But it is very interesting to your point about, you know, making this an academic exercise versus a, you know, one of risk.
And I think any better would also totally empathize with that, as, you know, you make 5 losing bets in a row, even for some of the best bettors, that sixth bet is not like an individual isolated bet. Those 5 losses prior to it have an effect and an influence on the sizing of that bet, even for a sharp better. Like, it should affect your sizing. In fact, if you have those 5 losses, and your risk appetite should potentially change to continue to intelligently risk manage your bankroll. And so you need to look at all of those decisions relative to the other decisions and relative to the broader context of sustainability of a coach's career, or sustainability of, for a better, like, your own bankroll. All right, let's move on to the Chiefs. Chiefs, I don't think there's anything we need to say about the Chiefs. The Chiefs are really good. Chiefs have a great offense. We're not blowing any minds here, but from an earned drive perspective, of course, Chiefs are number 1, 2.8 points, earned points per drive. So almost every drive, they're earning at least a field goal. So, and we can see that on the chart, again, a far separation from pretty much any other team, except for the Lions here. Yeah, definitely flirted with the Chiefs from an offensive perspective. But the defense still left some to be desired. On average, gave up around 2.1 earned drive points, and that was 26th for their defense. One of the other things I wanted to show out, this is a chart I put together last year around the Super Bowl, just to demonstrate how often the Chiefs team is always kind of flirting with disaster. And basically what this chart shows is each one of these dots is a play in the game, and each one of these dots is demonstrating, what was their kind of lead in that game. And we can see that they were losing, in almost every single game, and some by quite significant margin. But at the same time, we see them also leading a lot of these games. And this is one of the reasons why bettors, if you're betting pregame on the Chiefs, end up in the poorhouse, because the Chiefs are 14-3 straight up last year, 5-11-1 ATS. So there was no money to be made betting on the Chiefs pregame. There's such a huge Chiefs premium. But unless you're like Judah and I, lean heavily into live betting, and we mopped up betting the Chiefs last year, kind of over and over again, as these types of opportunities presented themselves. Oh, they go down and then they come back. Oh, they go down and then they come back. Down, come back, down, come back. And every time they go down, the markets don't properly adjust for the Chiefs to come back over and over again. But also, to your point, as you mentioned earlier, around playing, Eric, playing the Chiefs around the right kind of cadence in the season. This one, shocking. I remember I had to go back and actually double check this, but the Chiefs, week 6 at home versus the Bills as a field goal underdog. And I think you take a step back from the distance of where we sit today and look back and be like, no way, that can't be. And that just goes to demonstrate how cold the market gets on the Chiefs. And that wasn't just a last year thing. That happened the year prior as well. All the bears start coming out loud on the Chiefs in mass, especially around that point in time of the season. I think we made a bunch of money last year, Judah, specifically in this Bucks game and specifically in this Niners game, when the market, the market opened up with Chiefs as favorite, and then over the course of the week continued to drift heavily in the favor of the other team to ultimately end up flipping the other side. And as we know, in both those games, the Chiefs decisively demonstrated that they were far superior than both those teams.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I think the expectation, I think it's important to outline what the expectation was last year, right? It was a retooling team. Like, they had Mahomes and Reed, they could have been good. But it wouldn't, if there were any year where the Chiefs missed the playoffs, and I'm looking back from the kind of off season, it was like, okay, this might be the year. And I think it kind of just reminds everyone of just how good and just where the expectation should be for Mahomes and Reed. Like, this is the number 1 team. We should assume that, unless someone else is going to kind of come along and dethrone them. And I think that kind of reminded people of the Chiefs' dominance, and I think that's going to maintain throughout this season. But it wasn't that way last offseason. And I think that's kind of important to note as you're going through. And as we said about the live betting, I mean, the markets can't catch up enough, I don't think, especially leaning into those alt lines live, because the Chiefs can put up points just so quickly that they can actually run up scores, even, like offenses that most other offenses can't do. that is something to continually lean into. And frankly, I love the fact that the Chiefs go down. That's kind of the best betting value, I think, of any team anywhere in any sport, probably. It's just, backing the Chiefs when they go down live in a game.
Yeah, they've been well below 500 against the spread all the way back going to the pandemic season of 2020. I think that they were like minus 21.5 against the Jets at home, like right before the bye. They won and covered that game. And I don't think, other than the Bills AFC Championship game, they didn't cover another game. They didn't cover another game until I think the Washington or Philadelphia game in 2021. So it's just one of those, and for a few reasons, like there's a lot of backdoor covers against the Chiefs. So for example, that Chargers game, they were up 10 late, got backdoored in that game. They were, even that Buffalo game, they lost and they were dogs and then lost and didn't cover. They were leading that game for the majority as your numbers say, not by much, but they were leading that game for a decent amount of time. They got backdoored in the playoff game against Jacksonville, and so on. So there are just, they struggle at times with covering the spread. And the reason is, they're getting a premium, but the Patriots are getting a premium for all those years, and they were hitting at a 55 to 60% clip. Andy does this thing where like every coach in the league is connected to him. And so he does not like turn the screws to these teams, which can be an issue sometimes. So they're not a team that you really want to bet on, like you said, pre-flop, because you're getting the knowns. With Mahomes, and Judah knows this because of how much, props he does, like it's the Mahomes touchdown prop that you have to bet. It's the in-game stuff that you have to bet. It's the unders on every Chiefs wide receiver, and then you just win all of them but one, the one guy that blows up that day. It's all that kind of stuff when you bet the Chiefs. It's not betting them ATS pre-flop.
Yep. And we see, as I mentioned on that earlier chart, but also just looking at more granularly on a game-by-game basis here, we see the Chiefs were losing by a touchdown or more in 9 games, had a net deficit of a field goal or more in 10 games. So just goes to show, this team is losing by margin in a lot of games, kind of flirting with disaster. And not a lot of games where they come out and just smoke you right off the bat. In fact, it's funny, like even the few times that they did cover, I think most bettors, when we look at the Circa ranks, not a lot of green here, not a lot of green at all for a team that is obviously one of the best in the league. Bettors know that for the most part, you can't really bet the Chiefs because there's such a heavy Chiefs premium. But it is funny when we see that the betting market did think that they found an exploitable opportunity. In week 3 versus the Colts, the Chiefs were a top 5 pick. And then in week 13 versus the Bengals, they were a top 5 pick. The only time that they were a top 5 pick all season. And the rest you can see is mostly just red. And in both those games, they don't cover and they go 0-2. So
which is funny because like if you actually made that line, like if that game's in week 9 or week 10, like the spread is not -5, or I think it was like -6 for Circa. It's 10.5, 11.5, which I'll obviously make this as the strength of schedule point again. We thought the Colts would be a difficult game for the Chiefs in the offseason. They obviously turned out not to be. And another thing that we're working on, which is instead of looking at closing line value, which really is just capturing, I think, how bettors are positioning, you want to look at kind of the realized line value, which is like how would you actually make the spread after the game took place and how much are you kind of gaining from the closing line. And that's a perfect example of a game in which the results spoke very differently. But if we, played this game 10 weeks later or even, 3 weeks later, we'd have a very different line.
Yep. When it comes to offseason changes, we talked about, again, another refresh of the wide receivers, another refresh of some of the offensive linemen. I think just the main takeaway here is, or at least for you guys, do we think that, this is something that the Chiefs kind of continually deal with year over year over year? Oh, a few new faces on the offensive line. Oh, I'm throwing to a new set of wide receivers I need to develop chemistry with. And they kind of keep sneaking by with that. But can they keep doing it?
Yeah. This is some research I'm working on, which is kind of trying to study interactions and like what certain quarterback traits kind of mesh with different position groups. And the point is with Patrick Mahomes, basically none of it really matters, which is like because of his ability to create, and Eric, you've talked about this 100 times, but his ability to engineer throws, which is like, especially when he's scrambling, and his ability to anticipate pressure and kind of just create for himself, lends itself to a kind of when you're doing a team building exercise, like the offensive line doesn't matter so much because he's going to anticipate pressure, spin out of it. He scrambled, and this is really just like went out of structure on 131 plays last year and got sacked 0 times. That is like unfathomable. Most guys are like at a 2-to-1 ratio, and Mahomes is 130-1. And when you're kind of creating for yourself, and you're taking 4 or 5 seconds to throw, it doesn't really matter who your wide receivers are. They're going to be open just by virtue of being, NFL receivers on a field. For 4 seconds coverage is difficult. I don't really think it matters because Mahomes just elevates everyone around him to a degree we haven't seen in a long, long time. And like he still has Kelsey at the end of the day, and that's kind of been the
He's
bread and
33
butter.
now.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. I mean, like he'll fall off eventually. Tight ends, I think, have a longer age curve, and frankly, I really, so long as Mahomes is so dynamic in the pocket, I don't think the secondary weapons or even the offensive line is going to matter that much.
Yeah, I think Kelsey being there really helps. They do have to eventually think about his replacement, but since the 2020 Super Bowl, I mean, Brett Beach went up to Patrick Mahomes in the elevator on the ride down and said, "This will never happen again." And they were very desperate, when they went and got Orlando Brown. But they were very good with how they worked with Orlando Brown. They did not give him the extension. They go and get a left tackle for less than $10 million this year, who's probably better than Orlando Brown is. And then they get a right tackle in Jawan Taylor, who's much better than the guy that they let go, Andrew Wiley. Interior, they're best in the league. So I think that they got that nailed. It's probably overkill, to be quite honest, even as a Chiefs fan. Like, I think that the offensive line, they're probably going overboard with that. And there might be a puke point where their wide receivers aren't good enough. But I think as long as Kelsey remains good and Mahomes and Reed are still who they are, and the offensive line is what it is, it's going to be hard for them to be bad offensively. But I think the wide receiver is every single year a decent concern because, Brett, as you said earlier, they've had really good injury luck the last 2 years. They've had some injuries, but they have not been to cornerstone key players, the last 2 seasons, and that's covered up a lot. In 2021, they weren't a very good football team relative to standards, but the rest of the AFC was banged up, and that's how they got to host the title game. Last year, they took a step back, rosterized trading Tyreek Hill, but because, again, that they were healthy, they kind of lapped the AFC. If they have any sort of like median injury luck this year, it'll be interesting to see whether or not they're good enough. Because that's going to be something that they haven't had to deal with for 2 years now.
Puke point threshold, I think, is a great point around when is that threshold breached for the Chiefs. It makes me think back to, for anyone who's watched the Chiefs a lot, like kind of snap by snap, watching the games, you'll know that the Chiefs are not just always, awe-inspiring. The offense isn't just constantly clicking. In fact, I think, Judy, we've talked about in those kind of very tactical moments when those injuries did catch up to them, kind of in game, at least short term. Sometimes you're watching the Chiefs and you're like, they can't do anything. And then you kind of get that like one little spurt from Mahomes because he's so great and he just makes it work and they kind of continue to squeak it out. But like, how many times do you want to put yourself in that type of position? And then if you do breach that puke threshold that Eric talks about this season at some point in time, does that elongate for more than just an in-game type of series? And I mean, Kelsey, 150 targets, 110 catches last year. If he goes down, that's a lot to replace. And especially, I mean, he's that Gronk to Brady. When Gronk is gone and Brady was like, all like nothing worked, sometimes. And that's like just a huge vulnerability. And as he talked about the injury luck, if that starts to revert just to, as Eric mentioned, just even to median terms. That could offer some potentially sneaky downside in this team.
Yeah. I mean, I disagree with that. It's true, but I think it's almost to an extent. And like, I can think of 2 examples off the top of my head that I think are almost exceptions that prove the rule. Like the Super Bowl for sure. Like when your offensive line is just that banged up, like no quarterback's going to be able to overcome that. But it's the very fact that it took until that point, until we're like started noticing that the offensive line was bad. And obviously the offensive line is much better this year. And the receivers, I'm thinking the AFC Championship game when like so many guys went down to like MVS was the only healthy receiver and like he's throwing the practice squad guys. I'm not even sure who the wide receivers were. We were getting so deep into the depth chart, but like that's when we started to see the Chiefs kind of slow down. And yes, they're not necessarily so consistent week to week, but like those two examples really stand out. It's you were going so far down the depth chart, and just the base rate of expectation with Mahomes. It's like it doesn't. So long as you have NFL caliber receivers, I don't think it really matters. And I think they'll be able to kind of sustain this no man's land of wide receivers and still produce, even if Kelsey went down. I still don't think it matters. Mahomes can really just elevate so much more than any other quarterback in the league.
Yeah, I agree with you in general. I do think that there are breaking points, and I just don't think the Chiefs are that close to them this year anywhere but on defense, right? Like without Chris Jones, like we haven't talked about that yet. But like,
True.
I think that the issue with the Chiefs with Chris Jones is always going to be two-pronged. Is like, what if he doesn't show? But the other one is like, what if he just simply plays like he did in 2016 through 2021, which is like a very, very good defensive tackle, but not the league's best defensive tackle. How does that work? Right now, I think they're doing the sharp thing, which is to say, to pay him what he's being paid now and like have him come in and be kind of like what he was in 2021 and then move on because he's older. But it still leaves a hole in their defense until they have that resolved.
Yeah, and I think even looking at that defense, you've got a bunch of, I think, solid players, but he's really the superstar of that unit. And especially on the defensive line, I mean, George Karlaftis obviously has potential. Didn't really show it last year. I'm not really sure where they'll be unless they're scheming pressure. Jones really, I think, is the clear number one pass rusher, and that would be a gaping hole just because of the delta between him and the next guy up.
So I think before we close, then who do we think is going to be, take that Juju Smith-Schuster spot? I mean, again, like Tony, it's like such a question mark around how many games he'll play. It'll only be a handful. I don't know if he will even be sufficient enough to ever demonstrate any sort of, again, consistency or rhythm or chemistry with Mahomes. And then the rest are kind of like very young. Obviously, you have, Sky Moore. There's some highlights with, Justin Ross. They have the rookie, Reese, like who steps in to that Juju Smith-Schuster type role where Juju Smith-Schuster, was at least a veteran, who knew how to step in. Whereas that's not the same with the types of guys that you're potentially replacing him with.
Yeah, I think Sky Moore is probably the leader in the clubhouse. Like they really liked him during the draft process. He was kind of Smith-Schuster's direct backup last year when Juju missed the game against Los Angeles. He was pretty good in his stead. So I think it's him. I think Valdez-Scantling is going to be one of those where, he's never going to be that guy, although he was in the title game when they had no other choice but to throw him the ball. But he's going to be one where if you look at the prop markets and you see a team that plays a lot of cover one, you're going to want to bet into Valdez-Scantling. If they play a lot of cover two, he's probably going to no-show statistically like he did in the Super Bowl. That was always the benefit of bringing him in, was that he was a guy who could have a lot of variance because of who he was. And the games where the teams, played, shell coverages, he could just run them off and take a 0-for-0 like Tyreek Hill couldn't. And then the games where they single him up on Mike Hilton, he's going to have a game. So that one, I don't think Valdez-Scantling is going to be a consistent week for week guy. I do think it's going to be the Sky Moore, who's the consistent Juju week to week player. Even though Smith-Schuster down the stretch last year, he went over in the Super Bowl, but his average performance for the last 5-6 games this season was 30-something yards. So even he faded down the stretch last year in a time when the Chiefs basically won all those games. He wasn't really instrumental in any of them. So it is an interesting talking point, but I think the Chiefs kind of even got over it a little bit at the end of the season last year.
Is it Justin Ross hype for real?
I think he's going to make the team. I think it's going to be a classic, fourth, fifth guy, plays some special teams, does some red zone stuff, but I don't think he's going to be a starter.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if the response is yes, I think he'll make the team. It's probably a little bit lower expectations. All right. That wraps it up. Thanks everyone for listening. We just got done previewing the best division in football. I guess it's all downhill from here. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks Eric for joining. It was great to have you on. And that's the closing bell.